All right, so get this. We're diving into predictions for natural disasters in 2025. And let me tell you, these predictions are intense.
Yeah, we've got Lorenzo's predictions, and he really doesn't hold back.
No, he doesn't. He goes into specific detail about what he thinks will happen, where and when.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is that he connects these events to specific astrological happenings. It's not just like, oh, there's going to be an earthquake. It's like, okay, when this planet is doing this, you need to watch out for this specific area.
Right, so let's jump right in and start with earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Lorenzo sees 2025 as like a super active year, seismically.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And he points out some specific time frames to really keep an eye on.
Okay, it's like what?
He mentions March, April, then July, August, September, October, and November, December as times with a potentially higher risk.
Wow, so basically a good chunk of the year.
Yeah, pretty much. And these periods, they actually line up with some major astrological events that could be playing a role in all this seismic activity.
So break it down for me. What kind of astrological events are we talking about?
Well, for example, in March and April, we've got eclipses happening in Aries and Libra, and those are often associated with increased seismic activity.
Interesting. And then what?
Then in July, Uranus, that's the planet of sudden change and disruption, enters Gemini.
Oh, that sounds a little ominous.
It can be. And then around September and October, Uranus goes retrograde, so it moves back into Taurus.
Okay, so a lot of planetary movement happening.
A lot. And on top of that, we have the conjunction of Saturn and Neptune in Aries going on for a big part of the summer.
So for someone who's not super into astrology,
Yeah.
how do all these celestial events actually connect to what's happening down here on Earth? I mean, how could the movement of planets actually trigger an earthquake?
Right. It is a bit of a mind bender, but astrologers believe that the way these planets are positioned and moving around can actually influence energy patterns here on Earth.
Oh, okay, so it's all about energy.
Exactly. So, for example, Uranus is associated with those sudden shifts and disruptions, right? So when it changes signs or goes retrograde, like it does this year, those movements could actually coincide with some instability in the Earth's crust.
And that instability could lead to earthquakes.
Exactly.
So there's some pretty powerful astrological influences happening throughout the year. But does Lorenzo actually say where he sees these earthquakes happening?
Oh, absolutely. He points to some specific geographic areas that he believes are going to be more susceptible to earthquakes in 2025. He specifically mentions the Ring of Fire.
Ah, the Ring of Fire. Now, remind me again, where exactly is that?
So the Ring of Fire includes places like Japan, Indonesia, the Philippines, and the whole Pacific coast of the Americas.
So basically the entire Pacific Rim.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And he also mentions the Mediterranean region, places like Italy, Greece, Turkey. They're all sitting on active fault lines, so they could be especially vulnerable during these astrologically charged periods.
That makes sense.
Ah.
And we all know that California's San Andreas Fault is like a ticking time bomb.
Right, and Lorenzo brings that up too. He even mentions the Himalayas as a potential high-risk zone.
It's interesting that he's highlighting all these areas because they're already known for being seismically active. So is he saying that these astrological influences are just going to make things worse?
Yeah, essentially, he's suggesting that the astrological influences of 2025 could amplify the existing risks in these regions.
So it's like these areas are already on edge, and these astrological influences could be the thing that pushes them over the edge.
Exactly. It's like they act as a catalyst.
Okay, so we've got earthquakes and volcanoes on our radar, but Lorenzo doesn't stop there. He's also predicting a year of wild weather.
Oh, yeah. He's talking hurricanes, typhoons, floods, droughts, the whole shebang.
And he thinks it's all going to be fueled by this unique astrological climate of 2025.
Right. He sees June, August, September, October, and November, December as periods of heightened risk for extreme weather.
Wait, so those same timeframes he mentioned for earthquakes.
Yep. It's like those periods are going to be extra intense.
So what's driving these extreme weather events astrologically?
Well, he points to Jupiter in Cancer, which starts in June, and he thinks that could lead to way more rain and a higher risk of flooding.
And don't forget about that Saturn Neptune conjunction in Aries happening around the same time.
Oh, right. That's a big one. He says that could really crank up the heat and lead to some serious droughts in different parts of the world.
So basically keep your umbrella handy and your sunscreen close by because things could get wild.
Yeah, no kidding. And he also mentions Uranus entering Gemini in July and how that could contribute to the extremes, too.
How so?
Well, Uranus is all about sudden shifts and unexpected changes, right? So when it comes to weather, that could mean some super intense storms, strong winds, rapid temperature swings, the kind of stuff that can really mess things up.
Sounds like we're in for a bumpy ride. So does he give us any clues about where these extreme weather events might hit the hardest?
He does. He specifically mentions coastal regions as being super vulnerable. places like Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, the U.S. Gulf Coast, the east coast of Africa, Australia.
All places that are already dealing with the effects of climate change.
Exactly. And he also predicts a potentially intense monsoon season in regions that are prone to monsoons like India and Southeast Asia.
Oh man, that could be devastating.
Yeah. And for areas that are already dry and susceptible to droughts like parts of Africa, Australia, and the American Southwest, he suggests they could see even more extreme heat and longer periods without any rain at all.
So it sounds like Lorenzo is painting a picture of 2025 being a year of extremes, both with earthquakes and weather events.
Yeah.
There's a lot to consider here, and honestly, it feels a little overwhelming.
It is a lot to take in, but that's why we're here, to unpack these predictions and try to make sense of it all. And it's important to remember that as detailed as these predictions might seem, Lorenzo is talking about possibilities, not guarantees.
Right, so we're exploring potential scenarios, not saying this is definitely going to happen.
Exactly. And it's pretty much impossible to pinpoint the exact timing and location of these events with absolute certainty.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we covered earthquakes and extreme weather events, but what else is Lorenzo predicting for 2025? He doesn't stop there, does he?
Yeah. Nope. He also thinks that 2025 could see a wave of secondary disasters. Things like landslides after heavy rainfall or earthquakes, wildfires in those drought-stricken regions we talked about, and even tsunamis after any major earthquakes in the Ring of Fire.
It's like a domino effect. One disaster could lead to another.
Exactly. It really highlights how interconnected all these events can be and how important it is to consider the potential ripple effects.
So before we move on to the next set of predictions, are there any other key takeaways about Lorenzo's overall outlook for 2025 that you think are important to highlight?
Yeah, there's one more thing I think is super important to mention. Lorenzo really emphasizes that while astrology can give us insights into potential patterns and influences, it's not about predicting the future with 100% certainty.
Right, it's not like a crystal ball.
Exactly. It's more about understanding possibilities and probabilities.
That's a good reminder. It's easy to get caught up in the details, but it's important to keep that bigger picture in mind.
Absolutely. And we also can't forget about the role that human actions play in all of this. Things like climate change, deforestation, how we build our infrastructure. All of that can make these natural disasters even worse.
So Lorenzo's predictions aren't just a warning about the power of nature. They're also a call to action, for us to be more mindful of how we're interacting with our planet and to take steps to reduce those risks that are within our control.
Precisely. And that's what we're going to dive into next. We'll be exploring Lorenzo's specific predictions for each region of the world.
All right, let's do it.
Welcome back.
All right, so we've got a good grasp on the big picture astrological stuff that Lorenzo thinks is going to shape 2025. But let's zoom in a bit. What's he saying about specific regions around the world?
Well, he really zeroes in on the United States.
And what's he seeing there?
He's painting this picture of major political and economic turmoil, like some serious unrest brewing.
Yikes. And he thinks this unrest is going to affect how the U.S. deals with natural disasters.
Yeah, he's suggesting that it could make things a lot worse.
So what kind of events is he predicting and when?
He's talking major political scandals, big protests, especially in March and April.
Oh, right. Those are the months with those eclipses.
Exactly. Like those eclipses could trigger some massive shakeups, both literally and figuratively.
Okay, so political and social upheaval.
Mhm.
And then on top of that, he's predicting earthquakes.
Yeah, particularly along the West Coast, with the San Andreas Fault being a major area of concern.
So California needs to be extra careful. But is he just talking about California, or are there other parts of the U.S. that he thinks could be hit by earthquakes?
He's actually concerned about the whole Pacific coast, from the Pacific Northwest all the way down to Southern California.
So basically the entire West Coast is on high alert.
Pretty much. And it's not just earthquakes. He's also predicting some pretty major hurricanes hitting the Gulf Coast in the Southeast, probably between June and August.
Isn't that hurricane season anyway?
It is. But he thinks these hurricanes could be especially bad.
Because of the astrological influences?
Right. He specifically mentions Jupiter being in Cancer during that time, which, as we talked about, could lead to a lot more rain and create those perfect conditions for hurricanes to form.
And on top of that, there's that Saturn Neptune conjunction in Aries happening at the same time.
Exactly. So we could be looking at some seriously intense storms.
Oh. So
Yeah.
if you live anywhere near the Gulf Coast or the Southeast, you might want to start prepping now. But Lorenzo doesn't stop there, does he?
Yeah.
What about other parts of the world? What's he saying about Russia, for example?
He sees Russia dealing with a lot of internal power struggles and external pressures, like all this tension just building up.
Sounds a bit like what he was saying about the U.S.
Yeah, definitely some parallels there. And he thinks all this tension could spill over into actual conflicts, maybe even escalate the ones that are already happening.
So a lot of instability politically and in terms of Russia's relationships with other countries.
Hmm.
And does this tension play into his predictions about natural disasters there?
It's interesting. He seems to think that this heightened tension could actually manifest geologically as well. Like he predicts more seismic activity along Russia's eastern border, especially in those regions near Japan.
Ah, right. That's part of the Ring of Fire, too.
Exactly. So there's already a higher risk of earthquakes there. And he doesn't rule out volcanic eruptions either. He highlights the Kamchatka Peninsula, which is known for its active volcanoes, as a potential hotspot.
So earthquakes, volcanoes, and what about extreme weather? Does he see anything like that happening in Russia?
Oh, yeah. He doesn't forget about climate change. He's predicting some pretty intense weather events impacting Russia throughout 2025. He's talking heat waves and droughts in the summer, followed by some seriously brutal cold snaps and blizzards in the winter.
It's a good reminder that climate change is affecting every part of the world, even those places that are known for their cold climates.
Absolutely. So now let's shift gears and talk about the European Union. Lorenzo sees the EU facing a bunch of challenges in 2025. He's predicting more political division, economic instability, and a big surge in migration, which is going to put a lot of strain on resources and social systems.
Sounds a bit like what he was predicting for the U.S. and Russia.
Hmm.
A lot of internal and external conflict brewing. So does he connect that to any specific predictions about natural disasters?
Yeah, he sees a higher risk of earthquakes in southern Europe, especially along that Mediterranean coast. And he's also predicting those extreme weather events impacting the EU throughout the year. He's talking heat waves and droughts in the south and severe storms and flooding in the north.
And I remember him mentioning earlier that the Mediterranean region could be especially vulnerable to earthquakes during certain astrological periods.
Right. And he specifically points to Italy, Greece, and Spain as being particularly at risk for earthquakes and wildfires, especially during those hot summer months.
And then on top of all that, he's saying that the influx of migrants driven by climate change and conflict in other regions is going to make it even harder for the EU to respond to these natural disasters.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that all these global challenges are connected.
Definitely. Now let's talk about China. Lorenzo thinks 2025 is going to be a tough year for China economically. He's predicting an economic slowdown along with more social unrest and a tighter grip on power by the government.
So again, a lot of internal instability. Does he tie that into any potential natural disasters?
He does. He predicts a heightened risk of earthquakes in southwestern China, particularly in those regions near the Himalayas. And he's also predicting some major flooding along the Yangtze River, which is China's longest river. He thinks that flooding will probably happen during monsoon season between June and August.
And if I'm remembering correctly, you said earlier that those monsoon seasons could be especially intense in 2025.
Right. And he also highlights the risk of typhoons hitting the southeastern coast of China, especially between July and September, which lines up with that Uranus and Gemini period and its potential for those sudden weather shifts.
So China could be dealing with a triple whammy of earthquakes, floods, and typhoons in 2025. Okay, so what about India? What does Lorenzo see happening there?
He thinks India is going to face some really significant challenges in 2025, especially when it comes to climate change and resource scarcity. He's predicting some devastating floods across much of the country, particularly during monsoon season.
And we already know that he thinks those monsoons are going to be pretty extreme this year.
Exactly. And then on top of the floods, he's predicting intense heat waves impacting a lot of India throughout 2025. He thinks that's going to put a huge strain on their energy grid and water resources.
And with a growing population and increasing demand for resources, things could get really tough.
He's also concerned about potential conflict over water and other essential resources, especially in those regions that are already experiencing drought conditions.
So India could be facing a perfect storm of climate-related challenges in 2025, floods, heat waves, and a lack of resources. It's pretty intense.
Yeah, it really highlights the complex interplay between natural disasters, climate change, and all those societal pressures.
It's a sobering thought. But it's important to talk about these things. So what other regions does Lorenzo highlight? Where else are we going? Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground looking at what Lorenzo's predicting for the U.S., Russia, the EU, China, and India. Are there any other regions he's highlighting?
Yeah, he sees a particularly rough year ahead for the Middle East.
Oh man, that's a region that's already dealing with so much.
Yeah, exactly. And he thinks things could get even tougher in 2025.
So what kind of natural disasters is he predicting for the Middle East?
He's predicting more earthquakes, especially in places like Iran and Turkey, which we know are sitting right on those active fault lines.
And with all the tension that's already there, It makes you wonder if these natural disasters could actually make those conflicts even worse.
Yeah, that's a real concern. Natural disasters often kind of expose and amplify those existing societal tensions and vulnerabilities.
Right. So besides earthquakes, what else does Lorenzo predict for the Middle East?
He's also predicting those extreme weather events we've been talking about hitting the region throughout 2025, especially intense heat waves and droughts.
Which could make things like water shortages and food shortages even worse.
Exactly. And with such a large refugee population that's already super vulnerable and displaced, those extreme weather events could quickly turn into a humanitarian crisis.
It's a reminder that all these global challenges are connected and that natural disasters can have these ripple effects that reach far beyond the immediate impact.
Definitely. Now let's look at Australia. Lorenzo's seeing a fiery year ahead for Australia, with bushfires being a major concern.
I remember him mentioning earlier that Australia is one of the places that could see those more intense drought conditions.
Exactly. And he's particularly worried about the eastern and southeastern regions, which are already super prone to bushfires.
And wasn't that Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Aries supposed to contribute to those prolonged drought conditions across much of Australia?
Right. He's saying those dry conditions could make the bushfires really hard to contain.
So bushfires are a big concern. But does he mention any other potential threats for Australia?
He also predicts those extreme heat waves hitting the country throughout the year, which could really strain their infrastructure and impact public health.
And with climate change already affecting Australia's ecosystems, it sounds like Lorenzo sees 2025 as a pretty pivotal year for them.
Okay, lastly, let's wrap things up with a look at South America. Lorenzo's predicting a year of extremes for South America.
What kind of extremes?
He's talking intense rainfall and flooding in some areas, while other regions could be dealing with severe drought conditions.
So totally different challenges depending on where you are in South America.
Yeah, and he specifically highlights the Andes Mountains region as being super vulnerable to earthquakes and landslides, especially during those times with a lot of rainfall.
Which makes sense. The Andes are known for their steep slopes and all that seismic activity.
And he's also predicting a higher risk of volcanic eruptions in the Andes too, especially in countries like Chile and Peru, which have a long history of volcanic activity.
So a lot of potential for things to literally shake up down there.
And for the coastal regions along the Pacific, he's predicting a whole mix of extreme weather events, including heavy rainfall, flooding, and even tsunamis.
So it sounds like South America could be hit with a whole range of different natural disasters in 2025.
Pretty much.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground today.
Yeah.
And Lorenzo's predictions definitely paint a vivid and maybe even a little bit unsettling picture of what 2025 could have in store for us.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about, but it's really important to remember that these are just predictions. They're not guarantees. It's all about potential scenarios, and how things actually unfold depends on a whole bunch of factors, including our own choices and actions.
That's a good point. It's easy to feel powerless when we think about natural disasters, but we do have some control over how prepared we are and how we respond to these challenges.
Right. It's about understanding the specific risks in your area and taking steps to prepare for those risks.
And remembering that astrology is just one way of looking at these potential events. It doesn't tell us exactly what's going to happen, but it can give us some insights and help us to be more aware and prepared.
Exactly. And we can't forget about climate change either. It's real, and it's definitely playing a role in a lot of the risks that Lorenzo's highlighting. We all have a responsibility to reduce our impact on the planet and work towards building more resilient communities.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Lorenzo's predictions, what's the main takeaway? What do we want our listeners to remember?
I think Lorenzo's predictions are a really powerful reminder that we live on this dynamic planet that's always changing. Natural disasters are a part of life, but we can be more prepared for them by understanding the potential risks.
Right, being prepared is key. It's about knowing what to expect and having a plan in place.
Exactly. And stay curious. Keep learning about these things and take action, whether that's updating your emergency preparedness plans, supporting organizations that are working on climate change solutions, or even just talking to your friends and family about these issues. Every little bit helps.
Lorenzo's predictions might seem like a wake-up call, but they're also an opportunity for us to learn more and to get involved in creating a more resilient future. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Lorenzo's predictions for 2025. Until next time.